This next video is going to cover two sections, starting with our dissociative disorders and then getting into our personality disorders. But with dissociative disorders, you're going to find just from our descriptions that these are a lot more complicated than what we can go into in a course like this. So we're going to talk about them very, very briefly and acknowledge that once again, there's a lot more detail here than what we can actually cover. So the first of these is our depersonalization or derealization disorder, where depersonalization is feeling separated from your body. So feeling like you don't have any connection to your physical self. With derealization, this is a feeling that sort of you can be part of your own body. It's not that you don't feel connected to your own physical self, but you actually feel separated from the reality surrounding you. So in this case, you feel like the world is strange or unreal. You might feel while you're waking like you're walking through a dream. And those feelings of disconnect, if they are sufficient in terms of, say, intensity or duration or in how they make you react, to cause distress or other problems like our 4Ds at the start of the chapter, then it can qualify for this diagnosis. We do need multiple episodes of either of these cases to have occurred, specifically in the absence of some other sort of source, other cause that could be creating it. So things like if you have a sense of derealization while consuming drugs, that wouldn't count for this diagnosis. But this can lead to some similar experiences, feeling disconnected, feeling outside of your own body, feeling like the world isn't real, but in the absence of any kind of actual explanation in terms of sort of psychoactive substance. We also have dissociative amnesia. This would be a situation where you forget about sort of who you are, but specifically that is not explained through normal types of memory loss. So this wouldn't be following trauma. This wouldn't be following physical trauma, is what I mean to say. So this would be like if you suffer a head injury and have amnesia, that makes sense because there was potential for damage to the brain. But here, if you had, say, emotional trauma, you have an experience that didn't damage the brain, but has led you feeling sort of like you can't remember anything. You don't know who you are. You don't know your name. You don't remember parts of your life. That would fall under this category. And so we'll see sometimes a dissociative fugue as part of this dissociative amnesia. But this fugue is basically you forget pretty much everything about your current life and you may run off and live elsewhere. This used to be more common. It's very hard for people to disappear nowadays, to go and start a new life somewhere else, but it is still possible. So people would forget what's happening, especially in a traumatic situation, and leave to go elsewhere. And then the last one here, dissociative identity disorder, we actually get its own slide for it, simply because it's something that's been studied more and more in recent years. So dissociative identity disorder, DID, used to be called multiple personality disorder. And that is what it sounds like, where you have the presence of two or more distinct personality states within a single individual. And this is something that has a very specific connotation in media. So you've probably seen TV shows, movies that have, say, the villain of a show who has dissociative identity disorder, or someone who was abused, so a victim who might have, say, a protective personality or a protective alter as part of their personalities within themselves. Those are two things that are shown in media very commonly. And this is something that has been very strongly debated within the field because people want to claim that it's something that's an act, that it isn't the case. And there are some cases where an individual claiming to have dissociative identity disorder has been shown to be pretending. But there are also more and more studies that are actually showing that you can have unique things between these different states. So some of the coolest ones I've found, we can see differences in how they breathe, in their resting heart rate, looking at patterns of brain activity. So if we read EEG outputs of somebody who is in a different personality state, you can find differences there. Very interestingly, you could have different alters or different personalities would have different eyeglass prescriptions. You can have one has an allergy and the other doesn't. We can look at differences in vocal patterns, handwriting, handedness even. So there's all sorts of different studies that have shown these things. But again, very difficult to test because it's very hard to falsify. When we're doing our sort of scientific method, one of the goals is that it's something we need to be able to falsify or disprove in order to say that it's something we can claim is or is not supported by evidence, to have sort of a valid hypothesis. This is very difficult to look at and investigate in a way that would allow us to say that it's never the case. So there are pieces of evidence that seem to support it. There are cases when it has been falsified on a single case, but it's very hard to make a determination across everyone who's ever claimed to have this disorder. So yeah, an interesting one, and I mention it again because of that increase in popularity, increase in interest in recent years. And a lot of the cases when we talk about dissociative identity disorder, the cause is usually trauma related, where basically having encountered a sufficiently strong trauma situation, they might form another personality to protect themselves from that trauma or to keep them from remembering that trauma. So it could be part of, say, repression or suppressing that emotion and memory. But yeah, a lot of it ties to especially early childhood trauma. And so, from all of these, looking at our different dissociative disorders, you've probably figured out the common thread through all of them is the fact that they involve these disruptions and separations in terms of their consciousness, maybe their identity, their perception of the world, or even separation from their own memory. So, dissociating from some aspect of your day to day life, whether it's who you are as a person, what you can remember, or even your own personality, those all fall into this category. So again, nice and quick to get through that one. Our next part, though, is personality disorders. And again, we're going to touch on these very, very briefly. And I want to give, again, a quick disclaimer here that with a lot of these different personality disorders, they tend to have very negative connotations in both popular media. So if you see one of the crime TV shows and they talk about a narcissist or somebody with borderline personality disorder, BPD, they tend to be framed in a very negative way. However, when we're talking about these, we're just stating different facts, different sort of traits that are shared by individuals with this particular diagnosis. We're not saying anything about good or bad or anything like that. These are just personality traits. And so they're classified as disorders because of all the reasons we mentioned at the beginning with the 4Ds, talking about the effect that they have on either the individual with this particular disorder or those around them. So, as always, just a little disclaimer and the explanation as to why. But having any or all of these is not necessarily a bad thing. It is just a descriptor, as usual. So personality disorders, just like with our discussion on personality, they're going to be describing some stable, ingrained, inflexible, and usually to qualify as a disorder, maladaptive thought patterns. And those are going to tie to behaviors that tend to also themselves be maladaptive. So we're going to see patterns of behavior that tend not to go along with sort of the expectations of society. And I might also mention, I think schizotypical or typical disorder, that might be another one of those carryovers from the old DSM-4 that might be not as used as much, but it's included here, but we're not going to spend much time talking on it. I just wanted to point out that it might be an outdated term. Starting off, antisocial personality disorder. This is one that has, again, a very strong negative connotation in how most people think about it. So the reason for this is because it tends to have such a strong impact on society. So it's usually described as being fairly destructive. And the reason being because individuals with this disorder tend to not show anxiety or guilt, which we would usually link to a conscience, basically what tells us right from wrong. So they might engage in an action that negatively affects somebody else, but they don't have the feeling of guilt of feeling bad for affecting someone else. So they might not be anxious about the possibility of doing something wrong. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to do what they want when they want and not really have the same concept of consequences as others would have if they experience guilt and anxiety and that ability to connect and relate to others to understand how their own actions can affect others. So this unable to delay gratification of their needs ties to that impulsivity, where their main focus is not on fitting in with society or interacting well with others or helping others. It's going to be on what they would like. So they're going to want to do things that make themselves feel good. They're wanting to get what they want, because they're not really able to conceptualize sort of how they should be interacting with others. This can lead to manipulative behaviors and can, again, cause lots of problems in society just because of that sort of inability to work well with others. When we look at sort of some of the biological factors here, this one is predominantly seen in males. So almost 3 times more likely to be a male than female with this disorder. There is a strong genetic predisposition, and there is actually a gene that's been identified that correlates strongly with this disorder. Again, not deterministic, but it serves as a diathesis, a predisposition. And this gene is the monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA gene. And so this colloquially is called the rage gene because it was something that was discovered, reported to the media, and was immediately latched upon. There's actually a documentary called The Rage Gene that looks into the discovery of this gene and the fact that if the gene is non-functional, the individuals are more likely to engage in more aggressive and impulsive behavior. And there's lots of compelling evidence. The fact that individuals with this mutated version of the gene or non-functional MAOA gene, if we look at, say, prison population, the occurrence of that gene version is about 10 times higher than in the general population, and specifically tends to be had by individuals in jail for aggressive and impulsive, non-premeditated types of violence. But as always, because it is just a predisposition and not deterministic, this means that being raised in a low stress environment, a supportive environment, can actually mean that you don't end up with this diagnosis. So the gene itself is not deterministic. When we get into learning explanations, again, that supportive environment that you're raised in can definitely influence this. You can also learn to maybe be more empathetic, learn to connect to others, and predict how you should be acting in day-to-day life. It can encourage things like empathy, though not always. And then, of course, cognitive, having this disorder, as we've said, being sort of unable to delay gratification tends to tie to the inability to think about consequences of your actions in sort of a long-term way. You might know that doing this is wrong because I've seen the rules, I know the law, but you don't necessarily conceptualize what that means to you as an individual, which can mean that they're more likely to act impulsively, even if they kind of know they shouldn't. But yeah, we could spend more time on that, but I'm not supposed to, so we're going to keep moving on to try and finish this section. Next is narcissistic personality disorder. This is another one of those disorders that's thrown around a lot, again, in popular media, talking about somebody being a narcissist. They're self-centered. They're focused only on themselves. It doesn't always have to be a negative thing. This can just be an individual that maybe struggles to think about others. But we're going to focus on the facts once again. So these individuals are displaying sort of grandiose fantasies. Basically, they feel like they're more important than they really are. And again, this is taken to an extreme. As we've already seen, humans like to think highly of themselves, outside of things like depression, where that affects our current thought for our framings of our own self-image. There we go. But individuals with narcissistic personality disorder are going to take it to a more heightened extreme. So they think very highly of themselves, and in contrast, they tend to think very lowly of others. So they feel very superior, they're going to be very proud, they're going to maybe overestimate the importance of their own accomplishments. And this actually leads them to feel very little empathy for others because they feel so superior. Because their sort of self-identity is so positive and so inflated, they're very oversensitive to evaluation and criticism, basically because they don't think that others, pardon me, had to pause to cough. They don't feel like others should be able to critique them because they're not sort of worthy, they're not at the same level to be able to apply criticism. And again, this also sort of having themselves see themselves above others and sort of more grand than others. They feel like others should be constantly feeding into these feelings. They feel like they should be constantly admired, constantly praised, constantly held up as this sort of ideal example. Yeah, very, very different from antisocial personality disorder, but we can see how it's sort of maladaptive in terms of how we should be interacting with others in everyday life. Then we get into borderline personality disorder. Again, most of these have sort of some connotation in media where people have certain misconceptions. But borderline personality disorder, or BPD, this is a behavior where we have a lot of instability. So even though when we're typically talking about personality, we talk about stable behavior patterns, stable ways of acting, stable ways of thinking, but here, this personality disorder is actually characterized by stable cycles of instability. So these individuals tend to cycle from very positive to very negative states. So we're going to see that their behavior swings wildly depending on how they're feeling and how they're thinking at the time. That means that their emotions swing from high to low very quickly, and even their identity can shift. So they can feel very confident in themselves one moment and then feel sort of crippling anxiety and self doubt in the next moment. And so in this case, they actually can have issues with trying to integrate these two extremes in terms of how they think about themselves, but also in how they think about others. Because they can go from one moment being very confident to being very doubtful, but they can also look at someone else and feel like they are a very good person, a very sort of trustworthy person, and then immediately feel maybe mistrustful or like they're not as good of a person as they had originally thought. And so these constant shifts in how they're interpreting information and interacting with others can make it very hard for them to integrate with others. It's hard to maintain relationships when how you act towards someone can change so dramatically and oftentimes with very little warning. And so when we look at, so in here, so emotional dysregulation, so that shifting, that cycling back and forth, so they have difficulty controlling their negative emotions. And then those negative emotions are then counteracted by very, very extreme positive emotions. This also ties to those interpersonal relationships where they can be angry at somebody. So they might push someone away, but then they feel lonely. They feel sad and isolated because they're all alone. And then they might blame the others, the person that they've pushed away, for abandoning them. And so, again, sort of we're seeing this instability and maybe not being able to frame why different events have happened just because of these dramatic swings. So, our attributions can change depending on our state. And so, here, these individuals' internal state swings widely, and therefore their attributions swing as well. And this sort of instability can lead to impulsivity. So things like they might not care about long-term consequences of their actions, so they're more likely to, say, abuse substances or practice unsafe sex. They might also not hold down a stable job or be more prone to avoiding their problems, running away. So because of this inability to sort of have stable relationships, to have sort of stable behaviors across time, it can make it very difficult to maintain a job, to say get an education, and again, to maintain long-term relationships. Then we get into avoidant personality disorder, and we're going to be sort of very, very brief in these last few, but avoidant personality disorder is sort of extreme social discomfort and timidity. So these individuals like to, or not like to, they end up avoiding others to an extreme. Again, if it's a disorder, it's going to be above and beyond what we'd encounter in normal day-to-day situations. So these individuals tend to be very uncomfortable in society. They feel like they need to withdraw, they feel sort of unaccepted and inadequate in those social settings, and again, take it to an extreme. They have a crippling fear of being negatively evaluated. They're overly critical of their own actions and are constantly worried about how others might see them and their own actions. And they tend to sort of catastrophize in terms of how others might view and evaluate their behaviors, basically assuming that everyone else is going to think the worst. And this can lead to avoiding social situations. It can lead to them avoiding establishing different relationships. They don't have a lot of people that they interact with regularly. And by then not having lots of people they interact with, they then feel more judged and inadequate because now they don't have what they perceive as sort of the desirable relationship where they can interact with and trust others in a normal fashion. And then the last two here with obsessive compulsive personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. We've already talked about obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia we will talk about schizophrenia. So I'm actually going to skip these over and say that we don't need to learn about these, as we'll cover sort of the sort of disorders themselves in other places. So ignore this slide and this slide. And actually, we're going to do one more. I think I have time for one more topic here. So we're going to do part 8, which is our somatic system disorders, simply because I believe there's only 2 or 3 slides here. 2 slides. So somatic system disorders, this is one that I think I've mentioned at the very beginning that I'm bringing it up just because it's neat. It's not very common. This is very, very rare to occur. But it's one of those situations where something is happening and we have no idea biologically why. So all of our somatic system disorders have physical symptoms with no biological cause. So we can't find a part of the body that could create these specific types of symptoms. That's why they all fall into this weird category together. So the first of these is hypochondriasis. So this is, we now call it an illness anxiety disorder. So it falls under anxiety. It'll be one of those subtypes, but I'm talking about it here because it fits nicely with the others. But this is a hypochondriac. This is somebody who constantly feels like they're sick. They're constantly looking at symptoms. So maybe they have a stuffy nose, and instead of being like, oh, yeah, it's really dusty lately, so my allergies are acting up, they would then start thinking about, well, maybe it's a sinus infection. Maybe it's something's pressing against my nose, and maybe it's a tumor. So they're going to catastrophize all of these small things in their day to day life. They are certain that they're ill, and oftentimes they're certain that they're ill with something very dangerous, possibly even deadly. With a pain disorder, this is going to be a broad category. This is when you have pain that's out of proportion to physical stimulation. So chronic pain is actually a very large issue. It's something that's not very well understood. And so parts of it can get lumped in with these somatic system disorders, but actually chronic pain it could be its own entire topic. You could spend an entire chapter's worth of discussion on that. So we're just acknowledging that it is a thing, and we're going to keep moving. But the really neat one that I wanted to talk about is conversion disorder, which is sometimes called functional neurological symptom disorder. But this would be something like hysteria, which would have been what got Freud started. So when we have symptoms in the absence of some kind of physical cause, so things like sudden paralysis, blindness, or loss of sensation. And it's called conversion disorder because it's something where maybe you experience a really strong emotional trauma. And as a result of that, you go blind. And so we say that you've sort of converted the psychic energy from that traumatic experience into a physical symptom, which obviously makes us think Freud. So he thought that all of these disorders would represent sort of some underlying conflict that created anxiety that would then convert to our physical symptoms. These tend to run in families, but they are so rare that they are next to impossible to study. So our understanding of them is very, very lacking. But one of the ones that I wanted to point out, so what do you mean that you can have sort of a symptom without possible physical cause? Glove anesthesia might fall under one of our conversion disorders, but this definitely explains it. So it has a nice visual that I pulled from another course. But basically, glove anesthesia is like you've gone numb in the places where you wear a glove. So it's you lose all feeling from your wrist down. And the reason why this can't have a physical cause is because each of these colors here, sort of the yellow, the light blue, dark blue, and then sort of pinkish, each of those highlights the part of the arm that's served by a single sensory nerve. So in this case, if there was damage to this specific nerve, we would lose feeling all the way up the arm. But what these individuals with glove anesthesia lose is only from the wrist down. So for no reason that we can find, there's no sensation here, but there is sensation here. but that one cell should be monitoring this whole area. And so we don't have an explanation as to why we're having selective loss of sensation when we should, if we're going to lose sensation, lose all of this area that's covered. But we're instead losing bits and pieces, which is not possible with how our sensory neurons work. So yeah, interesting to discuss. And again, our understanding, we don't have one, but figured I'd mention them just because of interest.